Hey viewers, my name's Cara. I'm your host for Tuesdays here on the Pagan Perspective. This week we're talking about the New Age movement and Neopaganism, how they're alike, how they're different. This week's topic comes from Epically Curious, love the name, who said, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the New Age community. I know that Neopagans get lumped in with that community a lot, so I'd love to hear your thoughts on what makes you different and where you think the line is drawn between the two communities, but also what you share in common. So this is a great topic for me. I actually touched on something related to this earlier this year on my personal channel, talking about light workers and the New Age. And the New Age itself, like the astrological ages, is something that we've talked about on this channel before too. So the first thing that I think of when I think of New Age is the astrological ages and the Age of Aquarius, which is where the New Age movement gets its name. It's essentially about looking forward to a new age of human existence, of life on this planet, etc. The idea that previously in history, things were better, right? Things were less violent. People treated each other better. We knew things more deeply about ourselves, about the universe. We were more connected to divinity, spirit, whatever it may be. We did things holistically. We were more united than we are now, to certain degrees. It's this idea that we once had something that humanity has gotten away from, that we have developed ideas and new structures, new power structures, new ways of thinking that over time have divided us and made things get progressively worse. So this idea is that as we're entering the Age of Aquarius, all of these things that we associate astrologically with Aquarius are going to take place. We're going to feel more connected with one another, more united, it'll be more peaceful, all of these things. I'm greatly oversimplifying it right now just to give you kind of a general idea. This is where the name New Age came from. It's talking about the Age of Aquarius and that humanity and all of us, the whole planet, the whole solar system, everything, that we are moving into the Age of Aquarius and what that means. And of course, when we think of the Age of Aquarius, a lot of people, the first thing they'll think of is the musical Hair, the American tribal love rock musical. I had the honor and the privilege of being in a stage production of Hair when I was in college. I played Chrissy. She's the one who sings Frank Mills. And I love it. A lot of people, you could jokingly call me a hippie, you could, derogatively call me a hippie, whatever, I don't care. I am kind of cool with that. Obviously, I was not around in this present incarnation at the time that this movement was really coming about, coming of age, if you will, the New Age. But I was brought up by a lot of people who were. It was kind of like the generation before me. So my mom fits right into that category of people who were born in the generation that really kind of developed, a lot of them developed into the New Age movement. Obviously not all of them, but yeah, I grew up with my mom and a lot of people my mom's age, my mom's friends, being very interested in sort of New Age thought, New Age spirituality and religious ideas, and New Age practices. So we're talking about things like having a holistic view of the universe, that we should be concentrating on mind, body, and spirit. So that's kind of a key phrase that some people use to define the New Age movement, is talking about mind, body, spirit. Spiritualism is also something that happened earlier and is its own separate thing, but very much influenced the New Age movement and very much influenced my mother and the people that she was hanging out with when I was a kid and when I was starting to walk down my path as a witch, as a Neopagan. I was very influenced by New Age types of things. So we're talking about like intentional community, the idea of communes. When I was a kid, that manifested itself in the form of creative artist co-ops, cooperatives. So people in my area where I grew up were not living together in a traditional commune sense, but we did have sort of shared spaces where everyone would come together, and we called it the co-op, and it's where different people could hang out and do their art, do their meditation or lead group meditations, which we attended regularly. Some people were students of Reiki, energetic healing, laying on of hands, things like that. There were also several mediums, people who practiced spirit communication and channeling, messaging. So these are things that are heavily characteristic of the New Age movement as far as some people are concerned. I actually have the New Age article on Wikipedia up for reference, so I'll link it in the description. You can definitely look there. It's very involved. There's a lot of information here. But these are some of the kinds of things that would be characterizing it. Embracing what some might call alternative medicine, other people might call complementary therapies and practices. The idea of psychic fairs, of attending events where you would go and there would be a bunch of people reading tarot, reading palms, reading auras, Kirlian photography, the aura photography, where you can actually get a photo taken of your aura. Like, all of these things are considered New Age, as well as, like row upon row of shiny, glittery crystals and things like that. So these things are very much New Age, that are also things that a lot of people within Neopaganism have embraced, but they don't necessarily embrace the term New Age. So essentially the things that I'm telling you right now are the things that I still feel that I have in common with what is considered, at least from like a religious studies perspective, what is considered New Age. And then later I'll talk about kind of the differences and the ways that we use these terms negatively when we're trying to exclude people from the community, and what we don't like about them and don't identify with, and therefore we think that we're so super different. But yeah, things also that came from especially Eastern thought and Eastern philosophy were embraced in this New Age movement, which I actually didn't know, I just read on Wikipedia, is because, or at least partly because, in the 1960s, the US government rescinded what was called the Asian Exclusion Act in 1965. And so the Wikipedia article says that following that, even though there had already been an established interest in Asian religious ideas in the US, a lot more ideas and concepts from Eastern philosophy were brought into the US and embraced after the Asian Exclusion Act was revoked. So I didn't know that, but definitely practices like yoga, transcendental meditation, various beliefs and philosophies from Hinduism and Buddhism especially are considered part of what makes up the New Age kind of stereotype when we think of these things. Psychology also had a big role in it, humanism a little bit, because it was all about the human potential. There is a strong emphasis on the personal spiritual authority of the individual, that we are each our own ultimate spiritual authority. So it was very much counterculture, influenced by the counterculture movement of the 60s into the 70s. There was also a lot of emphasis in general on like self-development and making ourselves better people, because we were looking forward to what was going to be coming, or what is coming, in the age of Aquarius, and this idea that we think things are going to be better somehow. Some people have actually stated like ways that they think it's going to be better. Other people are just kind of like vaguely like, it's going to be better, which is one of the criticisms about it, is that it seeks to change what we have currently, but doesn't always give a clear idea of, well, what do we do instead? But there are now movements and different religious groups, perhaps, or can we even call them different? They're separate, they are their own thing, but there's definitely a lot of overlap here, that do focus on, okay, here's the actual game plan. Here's how we plan to make it better through our own actions. But yeah, so emphasis on self-development, self-healing, healing is a big thing. Like I said, what some people call alternative medicine, alternative therapy, like different forms of healing, but also just like, yeah, energetic healing, crystal healing, all of these things, which of course some people really dislike, were definitely a big part of this. And that reminds me that another part of it is the attempt to bridge kind of the worlds of science and spirituality. And that, again, because it was all about, and is all about, it still exists, connection and unity and working together and not having to fight each other, but like accepting that everybody has their own personal authority, everybody is entitled to their own beliefs, and so there's no like central unifying theology, but there are definitely some common core beliefs that characterize the movement. But this idea that we can work together more often than we think we can. The idea of eclecticism is also something that kind of became really popular as a term with the New Age movement, and it was meant to define this idea that because everyone had their own spiritual authority and there is no one right way to seek enlightenment or to seek spiritual truth or to seek religion or divinity or whatever, because there's no one right way, everyone potentially has really valid things to say and things that we can learn from. So the idea was, we'll listen to anyone who has great ideas about improving the world, making it a better place for all humanity, and how we can come together and just like be happy together, right? So whether that information came from a Buddhist monk or a Christian priest or a Wiccan priestess, you know, anybody who had really good ideas to listen to was valid to listen to. Now, the idea of eclecticism, as we talk about it in Neopaganism, has become a really derogatory term. People now use it to mean someone who picks and chooses from all over the place with no real care or regard for the original sources of those ideas, with no regard to the source culture, and sometimes diluting it or changing it so much so that it really doesn't resemble anything like the original anymore. And so we're kind of perpetuating false versions of things, which is then harmful. So this is where we come into the topic of cultural appropriation and other sort of related things, this kind of dilution of ideas and disrespect for source cultures, which is definitely an issue. And that is where we start to get into the things where I am not vehemently opposed to being associated with the New Age because of all of the things that do very much define, I think, a lot of the way that a lot of Neopagans today think about the world and practice can be considered New Age, but we consider ourselves Neopagan because the Neopagan movement is also changing and expanding and sometimes has different focuses. So you can be pretty much like more to one side of these two movements, but there's definitely some overlap there. But this is getting into where now, especially now, after the 90s, the sort of initial surge of like New Age thought kind of started to trickle away. It still very much does exist, but it's not as big of a thing anymore. And I think that's because it seems like a lot of us are being a little more critical of the negative aspects that show up when these things are taken to a really far extreme or are not given a specific framework, when we're not sort of drawing lines as to how far we think they should go. And we do the same thing with ourselves in Neopaganism as well, which I think is ultimately a good thing. But anyway, yeah, the Wikipedia article will tell you a lot more about New Age theology, philosophy, all sorts of things like that, concerned with spirit and channeling, the astrological ages, healing, alternative medicine, attempting to include both science and spirituality. And then it also gets into how, like, as this became more popular, a lot of people started to really heavily commercialize it. And therefore, some people started to break away from it because of that, because the commercialism was getting away from the core philosophies that sort of started the movement. Some people went really deep into the commercialism aspect and just like turned it into another capitalist venture to make a profit, which gets away from the spiritual aspects. So yeah, Wikipedia covers all that. Now I'm looking at the reception and criticism from different groups section here. So Christianity, Wikipedia says, tends to reject ideas of the New Age because the New Age places the emphasis on the human individual, our own spiritual autonomy and ability to make decisions for ourselves, and ability to look within to find the answers, that we each contain a spark of divinity, that God is in everything, and therefore we can engage with spirit, with divinity, with deity, whatever you may call God, in a vast variety of ways. Whereas Christianity tends to not agree with that so much. Obviously, there are different sects of Christianity now that very much do believe that. And so, yeah, there's all these sort of subgroups in all of these areas, right? But that tends to be kind of the biggest criticism from Christianity as a whole, as well as the Church of Satan also sort of became a thing in the 1960s at the same time that the New Age movement was becoming more of a thing. The Church of All Worlds was being founded, so I'm sure that there's a lot of conflation between the Church of Satan and these types of ideas of individualism and the focus on the self and things like that. Contemporary pagan perspectives and criticisms, it says, have to do with a lot of things that I both agree with and don't agree with. So let's talk about a couple. Some religious studies scholars say that there is a significant overlap between the two. Some say that they're pretty much totally separate movements but have slight overlap. Some people point out that some forms of contemporary paganism have really nothing to do with the New Age movement and are very dissimilar, especially those pagan movements that started before the New Age movement and never really incorporated it, whereas other Neopagan groups could be pretty much solidly identified within the overall New Age movement. Basically, some of the big differences that the Wikipedia article says exist are that the New Age movement focuses on an improved future, whereas the focus of paganism is on the pre-Christian past. Now, I both agree with that and disagree with that. I agree with it in that the roots of Neopaganism come from pagan history, which we consider pre-Christian, pre-Abrahamic practices of our ancestors before Christianity, Judaism, Islam, before any of those religions kind of came about. That's where we consider our roots to be. However, I disagree with it in the fact that not all people who identify with paganism are focused on the past. I don't think that's necessarily what this article meant to say, but it is what it said. It said, New Age focuses on the future, whereas paganism focuses on the past. I would say our roots are from that far past, and that's where we look to for inspiration and for ideas, but a lot of us are very concerned with modernizing it, making it appropriate for the world we live in today and the lives that we live today, and looking toward an improved future as well. So that's an area where I think some of us overlap. I won't speak for all pagans, never. I also can't speak for all people who are considered part of the New Age movement, because again, both of these groups, something we have in common, is that there's no one correct way to do it. So we are unified by certain things. I'm doing this because they're umbrella terms. We're unified as part of the same sort of demographic by certain core beliefs and practices maybe that we have in common. But within that, we allow that each individual group, each individual tradition, and each individual person can also have their own views within that framework. So we can't speak for everybody in either of these movements ever. This next thing I understand and I agree with a little bit more, and is one of the things that I think is an extreme definition within the New Age movement, which is that the New Age movement typically propounds a universalist message. I agree with it so far. Universalism is cool to me. That sees all religions as fundamentally the same. Okay, here's where we start to diverge. Paganism stresses the difference between monotheistic religions and those embracing a polytheistic or animistic theology. So I agree with that. I do not consider myself part of the New Age type of area that sees everything's basically the same, so why can't we all just get along? It's all the same. I believe in diversity, recognizing that diversity, and acknowledging the unique things about everything that makes them different, makes them separate and individual, and that those individual things are good and are part of our healthy progress, and that we can still work together and be part of the same community and respect each other while recognizing that we are different. We don't have to pretend that we're all exactly the same in order to get along. The next part says that the New Age movement emphasizes a light-centered image, whereas paganism acknowledges both light and dark, life and death, and the full cycle and spectrum, polarities, all of that type of thing. I agree with that. However, this is also what I did my video on my personal channel about earlier this year, because a lot of people I know who are part of the New Age movement now, today, there's a lot more of, I guess, what we would call paganism in the New Age movement. And again, I don't even like calling them different things, like as though if a New Age person starts embracing and acknowledging the darkness, that automatically makes them pagan. I don't think it makes people one or the other. I think it's part of this overlap of where we like to put people into different boxes and create full stereotypes that make them completely different. And like, if you start to have views that are more of the stereotype of the other, people start to tell you, oh, now you're becoming that thing, instead of realizing that we're all very complex and not one-sided in the first place. And so the New Age involves some of these other concepts that are not part of its perfect, clean, light stereotype. And paganism can also include some of these ideas that are considered New Age. But yeah, a lot of the people I know within the New Age movement focus heavily on shadow work for personal development. So they very much embrace the balance and duality and polarity and also the full spectrum. So I think these are also just ways that we are all growing and expanding more together. And then it talks about how many pagans have sought to distance themselves from the New Age movement. I'm quoting this directly, by the way. A lot of things that I'm saying here I'm reading it directly from Wikipedia. Many pagans have sought to distance themselves from the New Age movement, even using New Age as an insult within the community, end quote. That is definitely a thing that I've seen a lot of. And as I said, there are definitely criticisms that are valid. And I think it's just important to remember that not every individual experience within any of these movements perfectly fits the stereotype of what people expect it to be. The next section in the Wikipedia article talks about non-Western and indigenous responses to New Age practice. And this is where it specifically talks more about that negative aspect of eclecticism and the idea that since we're all the same at heart and we're all one big happy family, everything that belongs to everyone else is automatically also ours, and that we are free to take whatever we want without having to really engage with the source culture, without having to ask permission to use closed practices, anything like this. And this is something that definitely, I agree with this criticism, especially now. And this is something that we've been aware of for years and years and years, but each one of us individually doesn't necessarily become aware of it until later on in our practice. So like cultural appropriation and these issues, these have been an issue for decades that people have been talking about, but that like I personally didn't start knowing about until much more recently, like within the past 7 or 8 years, maybe, especially since college, especially since I started learning more about reclaiming tradition, which has a heavy focus on social justice and activism and talking about these things. And I started to meet more people who are not necessarily involved in reclaiming it all, but who also are very concerned with these issues and critical of the misuse of specific practices belonging to indigenous peoples and wanting to respect those cultures and practices and not dilute them, not change them, not claim them as our own and cause harm thereby. You know, recognizing that our ancestors have done a lot of harm already, and again, trying to look toward the future, trying to heal our past in order to bring us all to a better place where we can live more in harmony. And that doesn't have to mean we're all the same. It can mean we respect people's differences and coexist and live together in a way that is respectful of that and is respectful of our differences and embraces them. So yeah, I think a lot of pagans, a lot of neopagans get lumped in with the New Age community because a lot of us, especially today, and a lot of the people who are kind of more loud about it or who are more quickly found online about it might be talking about the things like energy work, energy healing, meditation groups, crystals, crystal healing, all these types of things that are very much stereotypically characterized as New Age. And so if any witch does them, although we might identify or we might more accurately be called Neopagan or identify ourselves as Neopagan or pagan or whatever, contemporary, modern, all these different qualifiers. If we practice some of those things, if we attend psychic fairs, if we talk about auras, if we talk about, again, energy, crystals, Buddhist philosophies, things like this, we can get lumped in with the New Age movement because those are the things that are characteristic of New Age. So people who mistakenly sort of think it's one or the other and you can't be both, we end up confusing the two because we don't know what came from what and the sort of subtle differences that can exist some ways. But there are also areas where I think people have tried a little too hard to differentiate the two, and there really is more of an overlap there, that the New Age movement isn't as stereotypical as we make it out to be. Neither is paganism. Not all of paganism is focused on the past, as it said, things like that. A lot of us are concerned with our present and our future. I think most of us would agree with that. Some people do attempt to recreate exactly things that were practiced in the past, but a lot of us don't do that. Does that make us New Age? No, I think that just makes us more focused on the present than certain people think the stereotype of our religious and spiritual movement is. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are my many, many thoughts and responses to the Wikipedia article about what makes us different and what makes us similar. You can also check out my video from earlier on my personal channel where I talked about light workers and the New Age, which was a lot of this same kind of stuff. That basically I think we use these terms derogatorily to make fun of people and to distance ourselves from people and to try to say we are so different. But, and maybe this is the New Ager in me speaking, but I think in a lot of ways we are a lot more similar than we would like to believe or are willing to admit. Thank you very much for watching and or listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget, you can also make your own video response, post it on your own YouTube channel, let people know in the comments what the title of your video is so they can click on your name in the comments, go to your channel, find that video, or you can just let us know your thoughts in the comments as well. And I will see you next time. Happy August, by the way. This month is the Pagan Perspective's anniversary. We started the collab in August of 2009. It is now August 2019. It will be our 10-year anniversary this month. So super exciting. I don't know where the time has gone. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome, blessed be, and goodbye.